The merciless sun beat down on Sarah Miller's battered body as she dragged herself across the barren landscape of the Arizona Territory. Blood seeped through her tattered dress, leaving a trail behind her in the dust. 3 days without water, and the gunshot wound in her side was festering. Each step was a battle against the inevitable. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, her voice cracked and barely audible. Her destination was nowhere. Her hope was nothing. She was running from ghosts, both living and dead. 6 months ago, she had been Mrs. Sarah Miller, wife of prominent cattle baron James Miller. Now she was just another desperate soul in the unforgiving West, betrayed by the man who had vowed to love her, left to die in Apache territory after discovering his criminal dealings with land grabbers. And corrupt officials. As the afternoon heat intensified, Sarah's vision blurred. The distant mountains wavered like apparitions. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the scorching earth. This was it. This was where her story would end, unmarked and forgotten. "I'm sorry, Emily," she murmured, thinking of her daughter who had succumbed to scarlet fever 2 winters past. Perhaps they would be reunited soon. The world around her dimmed as consciousness began to slip away. But through her fading vision, Sarah noticed something strange as shadow where there should be none. A figure on horseback, silhouetted against the brutal sun. She tried to call out, but her parched throat produced only a rasp. The figure dismounted and approached cautiously. A man with weathered features partially hidden beneath the brim of a worn hat. His eyes, clear and vigilant, assessed her condition with a practiced gaze. Sarah attempted to speak again. "Please. The man knelt beside her, his movements deliberate and careful. He placed a gentle hand on her forehead, checking her fever. Then he reached for his canteen, cradling her head as he tipped water between her cracked lips. She drank greedily, choking and sputtering. The man waited patiently, then offered more. There was something different about him. He hadn't spoken a single word. His eyes communicated what his voice did not. After she had drunk her fill, the stranger examined her wound, his expression grave but determined. Sarah noticed the scars on his hands, the kind that told stories of hardship and survival. He removed his bandana and pressed it against her side to stem the bleeding. When he looked up, his eyes asked a question. Sarah understood. "Miller," she whispered. "James Miller did this. My husband." The man's jaw tightened slightly, the only indication he had heard her. He glanced back in the direction she had come, then at the vast expanse ahead. Making a decision, he gathered Sarah in his arms with surprising gentleness and carried her to his horse. The pain was overwhelming as he lifted her onto the saddle. She cried out, darkness threatening to take her again. The cowboy mounted behind her, supporting her limp body against his chest, and urged his horse forward. As they rode, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. The rhythm of the horse's hooves became a lullaby, the stranger's strong arms her only safety. She had no idea who this silent savior was or where he was taking her, but in her desperate state, she surrendered to whatever fate he offered. Hours passed in a haze of pain and delirium. Fever dreams mingled with reality memories of her life. Before it all fell apart, the grand house in Boston, the journey west with James, the promises of a new beginning that had curdled into nightmare. At some point, the landscape changed. The barren desert gave way to scattered juniper and pine. They climbed in elevation, the air growing cooler as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Finally, they approached a small cabin nestled against a rocky hillside, partially hidden from view by the surrounding trees. The cowboy brought his horse to a stop and dismounted carefully, then reached up to help Sarah down. Her legs gave way immediately, but he caught her, once again carrying her in his arms. The cabin door was pushed open with his boot, revealing a sparse but tidy interior, a simple bed, A table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace. He laid Sarah on the bed with care, then moved with purpose around the cabin, gathering supplies. She watched through fever-hazed eyes as he lit a lamp, stoked the fireplace, and heated water in a kettle. His movements were efficient, practiced. When he returned, to her side, he had clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey, and what appeared to be medicinal herbs. He gestured to her wound, then to the whiskey, his intention clear. "Do what you must," Sarah whispered, bracing herself. The pain as he cleaned her wound was blinding. She bit down on a piece of leather he offered, tears streaming down her face as the whiskey seared through the infection. Through it all, the cowboy worked methodically, his face a mask of concentration. After cleaning the wound, he applied a poultice of crushed herbs and wrapped her torso with strips of clean cloth. When he finished, he offered her water mixed with something bitter willow bark, she guessed, for the fever and pain. As the medicine began to take effect and the edge of her agony dulled, Sarah studied her silent rescuer. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps in his 40s, with streaks of gray in his dark hair and beard. Deep lines etched his face, particularly around his eyes, not just from squinting against the sun, but from sorrow. This was a man who had seen much, perhaps too much. "Thank you," she murmured. "I don't even know your name." The cowboy paused in his work, considering her. Then he moved to the table, took a piece of charcoal, and wrote on a scrap of paper. He brought it to her. The note read simply, "Jacob, Jacob," she repeated. "I'm Sarah." He nodded once, acknowledging. Then he pointed to her, made a sleeping gesture, and pointed outside, indicating he would leave her to rest while he tended to things outside. As he turned to go, Sarah caught his wrist. "Why?" she asked. "Why help me?" Jacob looked at her for a long moment. Then he touched his chest, right over his heart, and made a slow gesture outward toward her. The message was clear enough. Because it was the right thing to do. After he left, Sarah sank back against the rough pillow. Outside, she could hear Jacob moving around, taking care of his horse, bringing in firewood. The sounds were oddly comforting. After days alone in the desert, with only the wind and her own labored breathing for company. As night fell and exhaustion claimed her, Sarah's last conscious thought was wonder at the strange turn her fate had taken. From the brink of death to the cabin of a man who couldn't or wouldn't speak. She didn't know if she'd found salvation or merely postponed her reckoning. But for now, she would accept this unexpected reprieve. And somewhere in the darkness of the Arizona night, as she drifted into sleep, Sarah thought she heard the howling of wolves in the distance, lonely, haunting, yet somehow less threatening than before. The fever broke on the 3rd day. Sarah awoke to morning light filtering through the cabin's single window, her mind clear for the first time since Jacob had found her. The pain in her side had subsided to a dull throb, and her throat no longer felt like sandpaper. She attempted to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her wound. "Easy," she murmured to herself, using her elbows to prop herself up against the wall. A soft knock on the doorframe drew her attention. Jacob stood there, a steaming mug in his hand. He raised an eyebrow in question. "Better," Sarah answered. "Much better." He nodded, crossing to her bedside and offering the mug. The bitter scent of herbal tea wafted up as she took it. Something for healing, no doubt. She sipped cautiously, grimacing at the taste but appreciating the warmth. Jacob pulled a small notebook from his pocket and wrote something, then handed it to her. "Fever broke. Wound is clean now. Need to rest more." "How long have I been here?" Sarah asked. Jacob held up 3 fingers. 3 days. She sighed, looking down at her bandaged side. "I should be dead," Jacob wrote again. "Not your time." A simple statement, but it carried weight. Sarah studied him as he moved around the cabin, preparing what appeared to be a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried fruit. His silence no longer seemed strange to her, but rather a natural extension of his character, deliberate, thoughtful, economical. "Have you always been silent?" she asked after a while. He paused in his work, his back to her. Then he shook his head slowly. "War?" She guessed. He turned slightly, giving her a profile view of his face. His expression revealed nothing, but he nodded once. "My husband fought," Sarah said, "for the Union. Came back changed." She laughed bitterly, though not in the ways that mattered, apparently. Jacob brought her a bowl of the cornmeal mush, topped with reconstituted dried apples. He wrote, "Eat, build strength." She took the bowl gratefully. "Thank you for everything." He acknowledged with a slight nod, then wrote again, "Your husband." "He did this to you?" Sarah stared at the words, then looked away. "Yes. He discovered that I knew about his dealings. Land fraud, mostly. Forcing settlers off their claims, bribing officials. I confronted him, and—" She gestured to her wounded. Sighed. "He took me out to Apache territory, shot me, and left me for dead." Jacob's expression darkened. "He wrote, he will come looking, only if he thinks I survived. Which he won't." She paused. "But if he does, I don't want to bring trouble to your door. Once I'm strong enough, I'll move on." Jacob shook his head firmly and wrote, "Not safe yet. Stay." There was something in his eyes that suggested more than concern for a wounded stranger. A flash of understanding, perhaps. Recognition of a kindred spirit. "Thank you," Sarah said again, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Jacob would leave early in the mornings to hunt or check his traps, returning by midday with game or fish. Sarah gradually regained her strength, first sitting up for longer periods, then standing, then taking short walks around the cabin. Jacob proved to be a skilled healer. He changed her bandages daily, applying fresh poultices made from plants he gathered in the surrounding hills. He never crowded her, always giving her space and privacy, communicating through his notebook when necessary. On the 7th day, Sarah ventured outside for the first time. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by pine and juniper trees. A stream bubbled nearby, and mountains rose in the distance. The air was clean and crisp, so different from the suffocating desert heat where Jacob had found her. "It's beautiful here," she said as Jacob emerged from the cabin behind her. "Peaceful." He nodded, handing her his notebook. "My sanctuary for 5 years. Few know it exists." "How do you live?" she asked. "I mean, do you ever go to town, trade with others?" "Sometimes." "Pelts, meat. Medicine woman in Navajo settlement, 2 days' ride. White settlement further." Sarah absorbed this. "You've made yourself quite self-sufficient." Jacob shrugged modestly. He wrote, "Simpler this way." As she grew stronger, Sarah began to help around the cabin washing dishes, mending clothes, preparing meals from the supplies Jacob brought. They developed a comfortable rhythm together, communicating through a combination of Jacob's written notes, gestures, and Sarah's growing ability to read his expressions. In the evenings, as they sat by the fire, Sarah sometimes told stories of her life before her childhood in Boston, her training as a nurse during the war, her ill-fated marriage to James. Jacob listened attentively, occasionally asking questions through his notebook, but never sharing his own past. 2 weeks after her arrival, Sarah found Jacob's Army discharge papers while storing some dried herbs. The name on the document read, "Jacob Blackwood, Sergeant, 10th Cavalry Regiment, the Buffalo Soldiers." A black regiment with white officers. The paper was dated 1868, 7 years ago. When Jacob returned from hunting that afternoon, Sarah approached him cautiously. I found your discharge papers, she admitted. I wasn't snooping. I just ... I'm sorry. Jacob looked at her for a long minute, then nodded in acceptance. He took his notebook and wrote at length, his usually neat handwriting becoming more hurried, as if the dam of his silence had finally broken. 10th Cavalry. Fought Confederates, then Comanche and Apache after war. Witnessed massacre at Salt Creek, 1869. Women, children killed. Tried to stop it. Superior officer ordered me silent. I refused. They took my voice, Sarah gasped. They? What do you mean? Took your voice. Jacob touched his throat, then wrote, punishment, rope, damage to voice box. Haven't spoken since. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. Jacob, I'm so sorry. He shook his head dismissively, then wrote, long ago, found peace here. Is that why you helped me? Because you couldn't help those others? Jacob considered this, then wrote, perhaps, or because I know what it is to be left for dead. That night, as they sat by the fire, Sarah felt something shift between them. Jacob's revelation had opened a door, inviting her into his world of silence, not as a visitor, but as someone who might understand. My daughter died 2 years ago, she said suddenly. Emily, she was only 4. Scarlet fever. She stared into the flames. After she died, something in me died too. I stopped caring about much of anything. That's how I ended up with a man like James. He was handsome, wealthy, powerful. I thought perhaps he could fill the emptiness. She laughed bitterly. Instead, he just made it deeper. Jacob reached across the space between them and took her hand. His rough, calloused palm enveloped her smaller one, warm and steady. He didn't need words or even written notes for this message. I understand. You're not alone. They sat like that for a long while, connected by touch and shared understanding. 2 broken people who had found each other in the vastness of the frontier. It wasn't romance, not yet, but something perhaps more valuable. Recognition. Acceptance. The beginnings of trust. As Sarah drifted to sleep that night, the howling of wolves echoed in the distance again. But this time, rather than seeming lonely, the sound spoke of wild freedom, of creatures who had found their place in the world. She wondered if she might find hers too, here in this unlikely sanctuary with a man of silence. The next morning, as she helped Jacob prepare breakfast, Sarah noticed him grow suddenly alert. He moved to the window, peering out cautiously, then gestured for her to stay back. What is it? She whispered. He held up a hand for silence, then took his notebook. Riders, 3 of them. Coming this way. Sarah's heart pounded. James? Jacob shook his head, indicating he couldn't tell yet. He wrote quickly, hide in root cellar, trapdoor under bed, stay quiet. What about you? Sarah asked, panic rising. We'll deal with them. Go now. Sarah hesitated and moved quickly to the bed, finding the concealed trapdoor Jacob had indicated. As she descended into the small, earthy space beneath the cabin, she heard Jacob moving furniture above, disguising the hiding place. The last thing she saw before he closed the trapdoor was Jacob reaching for his rifle and checking that it was loaded. Then darkness enveloped her, and all she could do was wait, listening to the approaching hoofbeats and praying that her presence wouldn't bring death to the man who had saved her life. In the darkness of the root cellar, Sarah pressed her ear against the rough wooden boards above, straining to hear what was happening. The earthy smell of stored vegetables and damp soil surrounded her, but her focus was entirely on the muffled sounds from above. HOOFB EAT approached, then stopped. Men's voices, indistinct at first, then clearer as they neared the cabin. Hello. The house, a gruff voice called out. Anybody home? Footsteps across the porch. Jacob's heavier tread moving to the door. "Afternoon, mister," the same voice said. "Sorry to trouble you. We're looking for someone." A pause. Sarah imagined Jacob's questioning look. "A woman," another voice explained. "Mrs. Sarah Miller, wife of James Miller, big cattleman down Tucson way. She's been missing about 3 weeks now. Husband's mighty worried." Sarah's heart pounded so loudly, she feared they might hear it through the floorboards. These weren't random travelers, they were James's men, hunting her. More silence from above. Then the first man spoke again, his tone shifting from friendly to suspicious. "You got a name, mister? You seem awful quiet." The scratch of Jacob's charcoal on paper. "Jacob Blackwood, huh? And you can't speak? Well, that's unfortunate." A pause. "Mind if we look around? Mrs. Miller might have passed this way. She's not right in the head, you see. Husband says she had a breakdown after their little girl died. Ran off into the wilderness. Dangerous for a woman alone." Sarah clenched her fists, anger flaring at James's lies. Using Emily's death as a cover story was a cruelty she hadn't expected, even from him. More scratching of charcoal. "Haven't seen anyone? You sure about that? Because one of the Apache scouts we hired tracked someone wounded to about half a mile from here before losing the trail." A tense silence followed. Sarah could picture Jacob's impassive face, giving nothing away. "Look," a third voice said, lower and more menacing. "We know someone came this way. Blood trail and everything. So either you're lying, or you're blind." "Which is it?" The sound of a gun being cocked. Sarah gasped silently, pressing her hand over her mouth. "Now, hold on," the first voice intervened. "No need for that, Dawson. Mr. Blackwood here probably just misunderstood." More writing from Jacob. "Found a wounded coyote few weeks back? Shot it and buried it?" The man laughed. "Well, that might explain the blood trail. Still, mind if we have. A look around? Just to be thorough." Heavy boots moved across the cabin floor. Sarah held her breath as footsteps passed directly overhead. Something heavy was dragged to the bed being moved, she realized in terror. "Nothing here," the man called. "Just some rugs." Sarah almost collapsed with relief. Jacob had covered the trap door well. The search continued for several minutes, men moving around the cabin, opening cupboards, checking the single bedroom area. "Place is clear," one of them finally reported. "Just this mute fella living alone. What about outside? Any fresh graves or anything suspicious?" "Nothing I can see." A moment of silence followed. "All right, Mr. Blackwood. Sorry to disturb you. If you do happen to see a woman wandering around, pretty, dark hair, blue eyes, probably looking unwell, you let them know at Fort Bowie. There's a reward." The sound of boots moving toward the door, then pausing. "One more thing," the menacing voice Dawson said. "If I find out you're lying to us, I'll come back and cut out what's left of your tongue. Clear?" The door opened and closed. Hoofbeats retreated slowly, then picked up pace as the riders moved away from the cabin. Still, Sarah remained frozen in her hiding place, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Minutes passed like hours until finally the trap door opened, revealing Jacob's concerned face peering down at her. "Are they gone?" she whispered. He nodded, reaching down to help her up. Once she was on her feet, he wrote quickly in his notebook. "They will be back. Not convinced. How do you know?" The one called. Dawson recognized the type. Hunter. Sarah shivered. "What do we do?" Jacob considered for a moment, then wrote, "Need to move. Tonight. Not safe here anymore." "Because of me," Sarah said, guilt washing over her. "I've brought this trouble to your home." Jacob shook his head firmly and wrote, "My choice to help. No regrets." He began moving around the cabin with purpose, gathering supplies, dried meat, hard biscuits, coffee, ammunition for his rifle. He wrote, "Pack only what you need. Long journey ahead. Where are we going?" Sarah asked, already following. His lead, rolling blankets, and filling canteens. North, mountains. I know places they won't follow. As they worked, Sarah's mind raced. "Jacob, I can't ask you to leave your home. This is your sanctuary." He paused, looking around the cabin with a wistful expression. Then he wrote, "Just a place can build another." After a moment, he added, "Can't replace you." The simple statement caught Sarah off guard. In the weeks of her recovery, something had grown between them, a connection forged in shared suffering and silent understanding. Neither had put it into words, but Jacob's note acknowledged it plainly. "Thank you," she said softly. By nightfall, they were ready. Jacob had prepared 2 horses, his own sturdy bay, and a smaller paint mare that Sarah hadn't seen before. "Where did she come from?" Sarah asked, stroking the mare's nose. Jacob wrote, "Neighbor 5 miles west. Trades horses. Owed me favor." They loaded their supplies, keeping the weight distributed evenly between the 2 animals. Jacob helped Sarah mount, checking that her wound wouldn't be aggravated by the saddle. Then he swung up onto his own horse with the ease of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. With one last look at the cabin, Jacob nodded to Sarah and led the way into the gathering darkness, taking a narrow trail that wound up into the foothills. Sarah followed, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had uprooted this man from his peaceful existence, yet grateful beyond words for his unwavering support. They rode through the night, Jacob setting a pace that was steady but not grueling, mindful of Sarah's still healing wound. He seemed to know the terrain intimately, navigating by starlight through dense pine forests and across rocky streams. When dawn broke, they had climbed significantly in elevation. Jacob led them to a sheltered overhang where a small spring bubbled from the rocks. They dismounted stiffly, both weary from the night's journey. "Where are we?" Sarah asked, stretching her sore muscles. Jacob wrote, "Apache call these the Ghost Mountains. Few white men come here." "Is it safe?" "Safer than where we were. Need to rest few hours, then continue." They ate a cold breakfast of jerky and hard biscuits, washing it down with fresh spring water. Jacob insisted on checking Sarah's wound, which had held up well despite the journey. As he replaced the bandage, his fingers brushed against her skin with the same gentle care he had shown since the beginning. "I'm stronger than I look," Sarah said, noticing his concern. He smiled slightly and wrote, "Yes, you are." After resting the horses and themselves for 3 hours, they continued their ascent. The trail grew steeper, winding through stands of aspen and pine. Occasionally, Jacob would stop and study their back trail, ensuring they weren't being followed. By mid-afternoon, they reached a high meadow surrounded by towering cliffs. A small stream cut through the center, and wild grasses swayed in the mountain breeze. Jacob directed them to the far side, where the cliff face revealed a narrow opening partially hidden by brush. "A cave?" Sarah asked. Jacob nodded, dismounting and leading his horse through the concealed entrance. Sarah followed, ducking low to avoid the overhang. Inside, the space opened up surprisingly. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the ceiling, illuminating a cavern large enough to accommodate them and the horses comfortably. Old fire rings and some primitive furnishings indicated that Jacob had used this place before. "Your backup plan?" Sarah asked, taking in the stored firewood and cache of supplies hidden in a rock niche. He nodded. "Writing. Found it years ago. Good place to disappear." As Jacob built a small fire, Sarah arranged their bedrolls and unpacked some of their provisions. The domesticity of their actions struck her, how quickly they had fallen into partnership, each anticipating the other's needs without words. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Jacob wrote a longer message than usual. Tomorrow I will hunt, find more food. We can stay here weeks if needed. No one knows this place. What about after? Sarah asked the question that had been weighing on her. Jacob, I can't keep running forever. And James won't stop looking. Jacob considered this, then wrote slowly. 2 choices. Keep running. Or end it. End it? You mean? Confront Miller. Stop him for good. Sarah stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes. He's a powerful man, connected. Even if we could prove what he's done, the law might not touch him. Jacob wrote, not talking about the law. The implication hung in the air between them. Sarah had never considered herself capable of violence, even against the man who had tried to kill her. But sitting in this hidden cave, miles from civilization, the frontier justice Jacob suggested didn't seem as foreign as it once might have. I don't know if I can do that, she admitted. Jacob took her hand, squeezing it gently. He wrote, not asking you to. My burden to carry. No, Sarah said firmly. I won't let you sacrifice everything for me. Your home, your peace, and now potentially your life? It's too much. Jacob looked at her for a long moment, then wrote something that made Sarah's heart catch. Some things worth sacrificing for. Their eyes met across the small fire, understanding passing between them without need for words or writing. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. 2 broken souls who had somehow found each other in the vastness of the frontier, offering each other a chance at redemption. Neither had thought possible. As the fire burned low, and they prepared. For sleep, Sarah remembered the wolves she had heard howling near Jacob's cabin. Up here in the mountains, their song would be clearer, wilder. Like her own spirit, she realized no longer dying, but reborn into something stronger through pain and hardship. Tomorrow, they would begin planning. But tonight, in this secret place between earth and sky, they had found a momentary sanctuary. Not in a place, but in each other. For 2 weeks, they remained in the mountain cave, settling into a rhythm of survival and planning. Jacob taught Sarah to move silently through the forest, to read tracks and signs, to use his spare revolver. Her nurse's training had given her steady hands, and she proved a quick study with the weapon. Each evening, they would discuss their options, Jacob writing his thoughts in his notebook, which was filling rapidly with their conversations. The simplest solution would be to flee perhaps to California, or even further north into the territories. But both knew that running would mean always looking over their shoulders, always fearing the day James's men might find them. He won't. Stop, Sarah said one night as they sat by the fire. Not just because I'm his wife, but because I know too much. About the land fraud, the bribes, the settlers he's forced out or worse. Jacob nodded, writing. Then we stop him. They developed a plan, methodical and careful. Jacob rode to a small trading post 3 days' journey from their hideout, returning with newspapers and information. James Miller was indeed searching for his disturbed wife, offering a substantial reward. He had also expanded his operations, pushing smaller ranchers off their land with increasing aggression. He's getting bolder, Sarah observed, more desperate. Jacob wrote, men like that make mistakes when pushed. Their strategy took shape. They would not confront James directly, but instead gather evidence of his crimes, evidence substantial, enough that even his connections couldn't protect him. Sarah knew where he kept his records, the names of officials he had bribed, the locations of land he had stolen through violence and fraud. There's a ranch foreman, she told Jacob. Eli Winters. He disagreed with James's methods. James demoted him, but kept him on because he's good with the cattle. He might help us. Jacob considered this, then wrote, dangerous to trust anyone. We need allies, Sarah insisted. We can't do this alone. After much discussion, they agreed. They would approach Winters cautiously, assess his willingness to help, and proceed accordingly. It was a risk, but a calculated one. On the morning, they prepared to leave their mountain sanctuary. Sarah found herself reluctant to go. These weeks with Jacob had been the strangest paradox, danger looming all around, yet a deeper peace than she had known in years. "It's odd," she said as they packed their belongings. "Part of me wishes we could stay here forever." Jacob paused, then wrote, "We could. Leave Miller to his fate. Find our own way." The temptation was powerful. To simply disappear into the wilderness, build a new life far from the complications of civilization. But Sarah shook her head. "We'd never truly be free. Not while he's out there, hurting others, thinking he's won." She touched Jacob's arm. "And you taught me something about standing up for what's right, even when it costs everything." He covered her hand with his own, a gesture that had become familiar and comforting in their weeks together. Then he wrote, "Together then." They descended from the mountains under cover of darkness, taking a circuitous route toward the Miller Ranch. They made camp in a hidden arroyo 2 miles from the ranch boundaries, close enough to observe but far enough to remain undetected. The next day, Jacob scouted the perimeter while Sarah sketched a map from memory, marking the ranch house, bunkhouse, corrals, and outbuildings. When Jacob returned, they compared observations and finalized their approach. "Winters usually works. The north pasture in the mornings," Sarah explained. "We could intercept him there, away from the other hands." Jacob nodded, writing, "Tomorrow at dawn." That night, as they sat by their small, smokeless fire, Sarah noticed Jacob was unusually pensive, staring into the flames with a faraway look. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. He took his time responding, writing slowly, "After this is done, what then?" It was a question Sarah had avoided asking herself. The future beyond their immediate goals seemed hazy, undefined. But Jacob's question demanded consideration. "I don't know," she admitted. "I never expected to survive this long. Never planned for after." Jacob nodded in understanding, then wrote, "I have some money saved, enough to start somewhere new." He hesitated, then added, "If you wanted company." Sarah felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I can't imagine doing this without you now," she said. "Wherever we go, I hope we go together." His expression softened, and he reached across to take her hand. Squeezing it gently in response, Dawn found them positioned near a stand of cottonwoods overlooking the north pasture. They had left their horses hidden in the arroyo, approaching on foot to minimize the chance of detection. As the sun crested the eastern hills, they spotted a lone rider moving along the fence line, checking for brakes. "That's him," Sarah whispered. "That's Winters." Jacob nodded, then gestured for her to wait while he circled around to approach from a different angle. Ensuring the foreman wouldn't feel trapped, Sarah watched as Jacob moved silently through the brush, positioning himself along Winters' path. When the foreman rode near, Jacob stepped out slowly, hands visible and open. Winters reined in sharply, his hand moving to his holster. "Who the hell are you?" he called. Jacob held up his notebook, where he had written in large letters, "Friend of Sarah Miller. Need to talk." Winters stiffened. "Mrs. Miller?" "She's dead." Sarah stepped out from her hiding place then. "Not quite, Mr. Winters." The foreman's eyes widened in shock. "My God, he said you'd run off. Had a breakdown." He studied her face. "But that's not what happened, is it?" "No," Sarah said. "He tried to kill me. Shot me and left me to die in Apache territory." Winters cursed under his breath. "I knew something wasn't right. The way he came back that day, all businesslike, saying you'd gone to visit family back east." He shook his head. "But I never thought." "Mr. Winters," Sarah said urgently, "we need your help. James has to be stopped. Not just for what he did to me, but for all of it, the land grabs, the bribes, the violence against settlers." Winters dismounted slowly, looking from Sarah to Jacob and back again. "You're asking me to betray my boss." "I'm asking you to do what's right," Sarah countered. "You've never approved of his methods. I heard you argue with him more than once." The foreman was silent for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he sighed. "What do you need from me?" The plan came together over the next 3 days. Winters confirmed that James kept detailed records of his illegal dealings in a safe in his study, records that would implicate not only him, but several territorial officials. He also revealed that a U.S. Marshal named Hargrove was investigating land fraud in the territory and would be passing through Tucson the following week. "If we can get those records to Hargrove," Sarah said, "even James's connections won't save him." Jacob wrote, "Need distraction to access the house." Winters nodded. "Miller's planning a big shindig Saturday night. Some politician from Santa Fe visiting. Most of the hands will be busy with guests' horses, security. House will be full, but the study might be empty." They refined their strategy. Winters would get them onto the property, claiming they were. Additional help hired for the event. Sarah, who knew the house intimately, would access the study while Jacob kept watch. If they secured the documents, they would ride immediately for Tucson to intercept Marshal Hargrove. Saturday evening arrived, clear and cool, with a half-moon providing just enough light to see by without revealing too much. Sarah and Jacob approached the ranch from the east, dressed as ordinary workers. Winters met them at the back entrance to the property, providing them with the servants' clothing they would need to blend in. "Once you're inside," he instructed, "you've got maybe 20 minutes before someone notices you don't belong. The guests arrive at 7, dinner's at 8. Study should be empty between those times." Sarah nodded, adjusting the plain dress she now wore. Jacob, in a server's attire, looked uncomfortable but determined. "Be careful," Winters warned. "Miller's got 3 new men. Hard cases. They're watching everyone." They made their way to the main house, joining the flow of servants preparing for the evening's festivities. Sarah kept her head down, her heart pounding as she walked through the home that had been hers just months ago. Nothing had changed. The same ostentatious furnishings, the same valuable paintings, all procured with money gained through corruption and violence. Jacob followed a few paces behind, carrying a tray of glasses as if heading to the dining room. They had agreed to minimize their interaction inside, reducing the chance of arousing suspicion. As they neared the study, Sarah glanced back at Jacob, receiving a slight nod. She slipped inside while he positioned himself in the hallway, arranging glasses as if preparing for guests. The study was exactly as she remembered, James's massive desk dominating the room, bookshelves lining the walls, the painting of hunting, dogs concealing his safe. Sarah moved quickly to the painting, swinging it aside to reveal the metal door behind. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked the combination James's birth date, which he used for everything, too arrogant to imagine anyone would dare steal from him. The safe opened with a soft click, revealing stacks of documents, bundles of cash, and a leather-bound ledger. Sarah grabbed the ledger and flipped through it, confirming it contained what they needed: names, dates, amounts paid, properties seized. She tucked it into the hidden pocket Winters had sewn into her dress, and carefully closed the safe and replaced the painting. Just as she turned to leave, the study door opened. Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice, as James Miller himself stood in the doorway, staring at her with an expression that shifted from confusion to shock to rage in the span of seconds. "You," he breathed, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Sarah backed away, desperately searching for an escape route. There was none. "How are you alive?" James demanded, closing the door behind him. "I watched you fall. I saw the blood." "You were careless," Sarah replied, surprised at the steadiness in her voice. "As always." His eyes narrowed. Where have you been hiding? Who helped you? Realization dawned on his face. You're here for the books, aren't you? You stupid woman. Do you think anyone will believe you over me? Marshal Hargrove might, Sarah sighed, watching his reaction carefully. James paled slightly before regaining his composure. Hargrove is being taken care of, just like you will be. He drew his gun. No mistakes this time. The door burst open behind him. Jacob stood there, having heard the exchange through the door. James whirled, firing instinctively. The bullet caught Jacob in the shoulder, spinning him against the door frame. Sarah screamed, lunging forward as James turned back toward her. They collided, wrestling for the gun. James was stronger, but Sarah fought with the desperation of someone who had already cheated death once. The revolver discharged again, the bullet splintering the desk. Jacob recovered enough to join the struggle, ripping James's gun arm despite his wounded shoulder. The three of them crashed into the bookshelves, sending volumes tumbling around. Then James struck Jacob across his wounded shoulder, causing him to lose his grip. The gun swung toward Sarah again, and then a new sound cut through the chaos. A voice, raw and ragged, unused for years, cried out, "No!" Everyone froze. Jacob stood there, blood seeping through his shirt. His eyes locked on James. He had spoken a single word torn from his damaged throat after years of silence. James recovered first, swinging the gun toward Jacob, but the momentary distraction had given Sarah the opening she needed. She pulled the small revolver Jacob had given her from her pocket and fired. The shot echoed in the confined space of the study. James stumbled backward, a look of disbelief on his face as he clutched his chest. He tried to raise his own weapon again, but his strength was failing. The gun clattered to the floor as he collapsed against the desk. You. He gasped, looking at Sarah with hatred and incomprehension. How could you? You taught me well, James, Sarah said quietly. To do whatever it takes to survive. Shouts and running footsteps sounded in the hallway. Jacob grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the window. They climbed out just as the door burst open behind them, men rushing to their employer's aid. They ran through the darkness toward where Winters waited with their horses, gunshots and shouts echoing behind them. Mounting quickly, they galloped away from the ranch, not slowing until they had put several miles between themselves and their pursuers. When they finally stopped to tend to Jacob's wound, Sarah's hands shook as she cleaned and bandaged his shoulder. You spoke, she said, still processing what had happened. Jacob nodded, wincing as she tightened the bandage. He tried to speak again, but only a harsh whisper emerged. He took out his notebook instead, writing, Had to. Thought I would lose you. Your voice, will it come back? Sarah asked. He shrugged. Writing. Does not matter. Said what needed saying. Sarah touched his face gently. Thank you for everything. They rode through the night, pushing their horses as hard as they dared. By dawn, they reached the outskirts of Tucson. Winters had directed them to a boarding house where Marshal Hargrove was staying, advising them to approach him directly, rather than going through official channels that Miller might have corrupted. The marshal was skeptical at first, but the ledger spoke for itself. Names, dates, amounts, a complete record of Miller's criminal enterprise. And Sarah's testimony about his attempt to murder her added weight to their case. This is enough to put him away for years, Hargrove said, leafing through the ledger. If he survives his wound. He looked up at them. You know you'll have to testify. Jacob and Sarah exchanged glances. Jacob wrote something and showed it to Sarah. She nodded in agreement. We'll testify, she told the marshal. But afterward, we'd like to disappear. Start fresh somewhere. Hargrove studied them thoughtfully. I can arrange that. The government owes you for bringing down Miller and his associates. He closed the ledger. There's land up north. Oregon Territory. Good farming country, far from all this. He gestured vaguely at the dusty town outside his window. I could see that papers are drawn up. New names, new start. 3 months later, after a trial that sent shockwaves through the territorial government, Sarah and Jacob stood on a bluff overlooking a verdant valley in the Oregon Territory. Below them lay their new home, a modest cabin, a small barn, fields waiting to be planted. Mountains rose in the distance, blue and peaceful. Jacob's voice was returning slowly, never to be what it once was, but enough to speak short sentences with effort. Still, he often preferred to write, the habit of years not easily broken. What shall we call it? Sarah asked, looking out over their new domain. Jacob considered, then spoke with careful deliberation, each word a victory. Redemption. Valley. Of redemption. Sarah slipped her hand into his, feeling the strength and gentleness there that had saved her life in more ways than one. From the brink of death to this new beginning, their journey had been marked by pain and loss, but also by a profound connection that neither had thought possible. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their land, Sarah reflected on the strange path that had brought them here. A dying woman and a silent cowboy, both broken by the world, who had somehow found in each other the pieces they needed to become whole again. They turned and walked hand in hand toward their cabin, toward the future they would build together. Behind them, from the distant mountains, came the faint howling of wolves, not a sound of loneliness now, but of wild, untamed freedom. A reminder of where they had been and what they had overcome. And in that moment, as darkness fell and stars began to appear above their valley of redemption, Sarah knew they had found what both had sought for so long.